right, if you will please turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We are going to finish this chapter. This whole chapter really has been a lot on marriage and how to deal with different aspects of marriage. And this chapter has been so long, we started it last year and finishing it this year. Yeah, that's a corny joke, I know. But it is a long chapter, and what we're going to see in this session and looking at verses 32 through verse 40, we're going to first look at singleness versus marriage. Then we're going to look at the treatment of virgins, and then finally, until death do us part. You might get a good idea of what point number 3 is about. So we're going to finish this pericope, this section, if you will, on marriage. And first point that we have is singleness versus marriage, beginning in verse 32. In verse 32, Paul picks it up and says, "But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried, care for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord." Now, Paul here starts off by saying, "I would have you without carefulness." Now, we have to remember kind of the context of what is being written as well as in the time that this was written. You and I might just think immediately, well, what is Paul saying about, we're being without carefulness? Why does he want us to be without care, if you will? But let's look at what the word in the Greek means, and then we'll kind of carry on. Without carefulness, in the Greek is ameramos. I'm trying to add another syllable in there. Ameramos. And oftentimes in the Greek, when you have a prefix of a, it oftentimes is a negator. It means to be without. And then the last part of that Greek word, merimna, means literally to care, to have anxiety, to worry, or to be fretful. So Paul here says, I want you to be free from anxiety. He says there, I want you to be free from anxiety, to be uninhibited, by worry and fretfulness. In fact, the Young's literal translation translates it as without anxiety. And this word is only found twice in the Greek scriptures. The other time is in Matthew 28:14. And in that passage, if you were to look it up in that context, this is right after the resurrection of Jesus, when the soldiers who were guarding the tomb of Jesus came to the Jewish religious leaders and said, "He's gone. What do we do?" People are saying he's been resurrected. And the Jewish chief priest said to him, "Here's the lie that we want you to say. That his disciples came and stole his body away during the night. And this is what the priest said to these soldiers in Matthew 28:14. And if this come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. The secure you part is the same as without carefulness. To be free from anxiety, to be free from care. The Jewish priest basically said, we will take care of you. You will be safe. And what a good illustration, if you will, of what Paul is saying here in our text. Paul here continues on by saying, he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to God, how he may please the Lord. So Paul here has given us this contrast, like in our point, singleness versus marriage. What does he say? Those who are unmarried, those who are single, if you will, Paul says, careth for the things that belong to God, how he may please the Lord. Now, Paul here is talking about those who are single. However that might have come about, Paul there says, you who are single, you can focus primarily on the things of God. In fact, careth, the word careth there, remember the last part of without carefulness? Okay, that's the same word for carrot there, but without the Greek negator at the beginning. So Paul there is using a lot of the same words, and he says here, you can care, if you're single, you can focus more on the things of the Lord because you are not bound by a wife. Now, I can insert 1,000 marriage jokes, not quotes, about being bound to a person. But let me tell you this, we are definitely pro-marriage here. Marriage is a wonderful thing. But Paul here is doing something wonderful as well. What is he doing? He's addressing those who are not married. Now, throughout this chapter, Paul has talked about the fact that being married is not a sin. But Paul has also said, I wish that you could be as I am, meaning being single. You see, there are some of us who have to be married, and then there are those who are like, nope, I don't need that. I don't need that. I am good just being a solo writer all by myself. That suits me. And that's a wonderful aspect to come to that conclusion. Whatever you fall into to know, yeah, I'm someone who needs to be married, or I am someone who doesn't have to be married. And I believe that we as a church ought to exalt both. Because sometimes we might point out those who are single, especially if they tend to be on the younger side. We have 4 teenagers in the room. And eventually, as they turn into their 20s, oftentimes what those in the church will do is, so, have you met someone? When are you getting married? And then you start putting that pressure on those people who we might not know, but they might be someone who says, I don't need to be married. If it happens, it happens. If not, oh well. So we need to be careful. Yes, we want to encourage people to get married, but we also want to encourage those who find that they are content in their singleness to stay in their singleness. Why? Because as Paul says here, that they can please the Lord. They can care for the things that belong to God. They're going to have more time to be able to focus on serving the Lord. Paul talks about this here, and he just says, you're going to have that free time. I remember before Nisha and I were together, if I wanted to, I could buy a ticket tonight, get on a plane tomorrow, and head to Uganda. Or wherever. I mean, obviously now with COVID, who knows what's going on. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes, when living in Southern California, someone would say, hey, Geoff, you want to go down to Mexico? We're going to do a little mission outreach for the weekend. Yeah, I'll go. You know, I didn't have to go home and say, sorry, honey, I'm going to Mexico tomorrow. Those of you who are married, you know how difficult that can be. Hey, I'm going to be gone for the weekend. Is it a bad thing? Of course not. But we have responsibilities, those of us who are married, to our spouses, and if you still have kids at home like we do, to our kids and that whole situation. You can't just get up and go. But when you're single, those of you who are single in here, you know what I'm talking about. You can be like, you know what? I don't want to go anywhere today. And you can just sit at home and do nothing. You know what? I want to go to town today, or I want to go watch a movie. And you have that freedom. But Paul here is bringing it in our text to say, you have that freedom to be able to serve God if given that opportunity. You can just get up and go. You can just go. You can minister to someone. You don't have that binding, if you will. Verse 33. But he that is married careth, he says, for the things that are of the world. Now, oftentimes we look at that and says, you know, we hear of the world, and a lot of times in the Christian realm, we'll say that, you know, we want to not be part of the world, and so it looks as a negative. But what Paul there is saying is, if you're married, you care for the things of the world, meaning, what does he say there? How he may please his wife. How he may please his wife. By the way, the word careth there is the same as in verse 32, merimnao. We've already looked at that one. But what is Paul saying there? If you're married, your first care ought to be about your spouse. I will say this, that is probably one of the issues of many marriages today, is that neither spouse thinks of the other one first. It's, what do I want to do? I don't care about that old ball and chain. She can stay home. She can stay there and wait for me. So when I feel good and ready, I'm coming home, and she better have a hot plate of food ready for me. Yeah, you want to get a skillet thrown at you. We've talked about marriage and talked about how it is difficult. And if you marry the wrong person, there could be some issues in your relationship. And yet Paul here says, he that is married careth for the things that are of the world. What is Paul there saying? He's saying that those who are married focus about taking care of their people, their spouse, their kids, or whoever it might be. You have those responsibilities. Those of you who are single, if you don't get up and clean the toilets that day, who's to blame? You. Right? You only have yourself to blame. If you just get up and say, man, I'm too tired to cook dinner, and you go hungry, who's to blame? You, because you made that choice. But in a marriage relationship, when you do something, it not only affects you, but it affects your spouse and, again, your kids and so forth. And so Paul here is kind of wrapping all of this up, making some very, not deep statements, but it's pretty obvious. When you're married, you care about that other person, you think about them. And you worry about them, and you want to make sure that things are taken care of. Rightfully so. Continuing on in verse 34, Paul then goes on to say, there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman, the virgin, if you will, careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So now what is Paul doing? Not only is he contrasting it and now basically saying it on the woman's side of the marriage relationship, but also talking about the female who was single. And so he basically goes over everything again that we had already looked at in verses 32 and 33. He's basically saying, here they are. Now, the word virgin, we've had this Greek before, but just by way of review. The Greek for virgin is Parthenos. Think of the Parthenon, the Greek temple, right? Parthenos, it means a virgin, a maiden, but also oftentimes will carry with it the idea of a virgin daughter who's of marriageable age. Someone who is eligible or old enough, really, to be married. And that's kind of the idea there of the word. And so Paul here says, and it's interesting that he uses this primarily in reference to the female daughters, if you will. And says if they are, let me get back to my text here. And he says there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. Notice there, he says there's a difference. You can compare them two. One who is married and one who is not. It's pretty obvious. One who can just focus on serving the Lord and just doing whatever she may please. And then the other who's got her husband and kids to worry about and focus on. You see, Scripture tells us especially in Matthew 6:25 through 34. That worrying about material things of life is a sinful anxiety. But what we see Paul doing here in our text is saying, in a way, contrasting that passage from Matthew and saying, if it's focused on wanting to provide for your family, for your spouse, however it might be, that's a good thing. We want our young people who get married to be focused on wanting to take care of each other. And worry about that, as in you focus on that, go, okay, this is why I have to get up at 6 o'clock every morning, because I have a job. If I don't get up, then I don't work, I don't get paid, I get fired, and I lose my job, and it just kind of continues to get worse. And so Paul here is saying, this is a good, unselfish, healthy aspect of wanting to take care of one's needs. Now, can it go beyond that? Of course it can. That's where that passage in Matthew comes in as well. You got to strike that fine balance. But those of you who have been married for some time, you know this to be true, that marriage requires time and energy to work. I forget which session it was on, and I forget exactly what verse. I should have looked it up. It was in chapter 7 here, but Paul basically says, hey, before you get married, make sure you go in with your eyes wide open. Make sure you figure out what's going on and who you're marrying. Because if you marry the wrong person, it might create difficulty in your life. And you need to seek advice and to know and to understand that marriage is not going to be the cure-all for all of your issues that you're dealing with. I think it was last week I said, I thought I was one way before I got married. When I got married, it was like Nisha was carrying around a huge mirror to me, showing me how selfish I was and self-centered and focused and sinful and all of that. It was just like, you're horrible. Now, she wasn't saying that to me, but being in that relationship revealed it to me. And so we ought to be careful going in. Point number 2. What are we seeing here? Point number 2, Paul then specifically talks about the treatment of virgins, verses 35 through 38. And he says, in this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. So Paul here in verse 35 says, in this I speak for your own profit. Paul here says, this is something that is going to be profitable for you. In fact, the word profit in the Greek is sumphero. Sumphero, it's got the Greek prefix of S-U-N, soon. Soon means together. Sometimes in English, it is translated as S-Y-N or S-Y-M. Think of now I can't say symphony. Thank you. I'm trying to say symphony and sympathy and trying to squish those two words together. But it's that coming together, right? It's that whole coming together type of aspect. So Paul says, I want it to be coming together, or think of like synchronize, right? Synchronize, S-Y-N, that whole coming together. And then the last part of sumphero is pharaoh, to bring. So basically, Paul is there saying, I want you guys to bring it all together, or really to make it well and profitable. Paul says, I speak for your own profit. You know, like when you would talk to your kids and say, hey, this is good advice right here. I'm going to give you guys some good advice. And your teenagers kind of have that blank look, like, yeah, whatever. Right? That's what Paul is doing here, saying, here is something good for you. Something tangible, something that you can hold on to, something that you can take. That something will spare you in the future. And so Paul here says, not that I may cast a snare upon you. So now what Paul says is, I'm not going to cast a snare on you. He goes, I want to give you something that is going to encourage and help you to be profitable, not something that would be a snare. Now, when we look at the word or the phrases here, I may cast. I may cast. The Greek is epibalo. Epibalo. The epi prefix intensifies or strengthens the word. And then balo there in Greek, it's really easy to remember what balo means. Okay? Balo sounds like a ball. And what do you do with a ball? You throw it. Right? So easy way to remember. So balo means to throw or to throw. So epibalo means to throw upon. So Paul here is saying, I may cast. Think of like when a fisherman would use his net and he would cast it upon the waters to try to catch the fish. Or today, most fishermen will use a rod and a pole, right? Or a pole and some fishing line. You can tell how often I fish. You know, that whole thing. Right? What are you doing? You cast it out. Right? Isn't that the word? You cast it out. You're sending it out to throw upon, and then he says there is snare. Interesting thing about this word for snare in the Greek. First of all, this is the only time it's found in all of the Greek scriptures. This is the only time. The Greek is brokos, and it literally means a slip knot or a noose. A slip knot or a noose. And really the idea carries with it the idea of hanging someone. In fact, in Greek mythology, they use this same word to describe certain demigods or whoever who get hung by various means. Later on, the same word, brokos, changed its meaning and kind of made it into more of a snare or a net. So basically, what is Paul saying here? I want to be profitable. I don't want to come upon you and throw upon you a snare or a noose. I don't want to force you to do something you don't want to do. Because if you put a snare or a rope on someone, what are you doing? You're forcing them to do something. It's almost like having a prisoner. Right? You lock them up, you put that rope on them, or today we put handcuffs on them. I mean, even think with the aspect of hanging. Most of the time, that's not what that person wants done to them. But they're caught up, literally, in that type of situation. And so what Paul is saying here is, he's talking about marriage. I don't want to put that noose on you. Much in the same way, and a little side note, I was kind of speaking against Roman Catholicism already during the Lord's Supper, but, Roman Catholics are notorious for part of their religion making it where the church leaders are not married. Guess what they're doing? They're putting a noose on their church laity because some of those men want to get married or would love to get married. And that's kind of a good example of what Paul is saying here is, I don't want you to feel caught up that you have to get married or you can't get married. If you're single and you know that and you want to stay that way. But if you want to be married, then go for it. Be married. You have the freedom to choose either way. You don't have to be caught up as in a noose or in a snare, saying, I can't get married or I have to get married. And then Paul continues on. But for that which is comely. Now the word comely, I'm going to admit, I had no idea what comely was. It's not a word I use very often. But comely literally means, in the Greek, well-fashioned or well-formed. Well-fashioned or well-formed. So he says there, that which is well-fashioned or well-formed, and then he goes on, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. So what is he saying there? He says, I don't want to put that noose on you. If you want to be single, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. I don't want you to have to worry about the things of this world. If you can be single and serve the Lord, do it. That would be great. That way you won't be distracted by another person and then gets caught up in the things of the world that he talked about in the previous passage. That you would be able to fully serve the Lord and the church without having to worry about what's going to be the effect of your wife and your kids. I know that for being a married man of 4 kids, there's many more things I would love to do even for the church here, but I just don't have the time. Because I have responsibilities. And Paul is saying if you're single, you don't have as many of those responsibilities that you need to worry about. And then in verse 36, look what he says in verse 36. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. So what is Paul saying here? He says, but if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely towards his virgin. Uncomely there is basically the same word as comely in the Greek, just with the negative prefix to it. So basically, Paul is saying there, if a man is behaving in an appropriate appearance towards his virgin. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. When I taught 1 Corinthians 100 years ago in California, I took this passage in the wrong way. I took this passage as a man who's got a good-looking girlfriend, because every man would not get with an ugly girl. It just doesn't happen. Ask every husband in here if they think their wife is good looking. And if they don't want a skillet thrown at their heads, they will say she is. Right? You should be madly in love with your wives. And that's how I often would look at this passage, meaning, okay, a man is acting in an appropriate appearance towards his virgin or his girlfriend, right? But that's not what Paul is saying here. Just to give you guys a little snippet about what is to come. And then he says here, if she pass the flower of her age. If she passed the flower of her age, in the Greek it just basically means she is one who's beyond the usual age for marriage. That's what Paul is talking about here. He's saying that if there is a man who is acting uncomely towards his virgin who is past the flower of her age. So what are we having here? We're having now a man and a woman who has not been married, yet she's getting to the point in her life where she's not at the usual marriageable age, whatever that may be. Then Paul says this, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. Now Paul here is saying, listen, if the virgin wants to get married, even though she's past the marriageable age, whatever that might be, Paul says, let her get married. Don't keep her from getting married just because she might be older, might be beyond childbearing age. Still allow her to get married. And notice the last part he says there, let them marry. Let them marry. That's a command, actually. And Paul's repeating himself from verse 28. Look back at verse 28. What does Paul say? But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Again, it goes directly against the Roman Catholicism teaching. It shouldn't only be good for just a certain amount of people. If you want to get married, it's a great thing. If you don't, it's a great thing. Now, which man are we talking about now in this relationship? It would seem to imply in the passage and from the Greek that the man is the father. Marcia's nodding along. I think she had already picked up on it. But is the father of the virgin daughter. And of course, back then, oftentimes what would happen is a woman who was single and not married, she would still continue to live at home. So she was under her father's authority. In fact, there's a good number of scriptures, I gave them to you guys, throughout all of the scriptures really, where we see that a daughter is referred to as her father's virgin or something along that type of line. That it was never an aspect of a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. When was the last time you heard of a boyfriend-girlfriend referring to each other as, oh, there's my virgin girlfriend? But you see, what was happening back in the day was that the father would be like, yeah, these are my virgin daughters. Think about the account of Lot in Sodom. And remember when the angels were pounding on the crowd, that would be really mixed up Bible. But the crowd was pounding on the doors of Lot, wanting to have homosexual relations with the angels who came to Lot to say, get out of Sodom now. And they were there they were wanting to sexually abuse these men. And what did Lot say? Here are my virgins. And there's other accounts where there's a father saying, these are my virgin daughters. So the idea here in this passage, Paul is saying, if you are a man, a father, and you have a virgin daughter, and she, is beyond the age of being married, still let her get married. There's it doesn't matter what society says. You're never too old to get married. Paul says there's nothing wrong with that at all. Look at verse 37. Before we get into it, though, I do want to say this. All of this, too, what we see is that, the father, the man, even though he might have an adult child living in his home, he is to treat her well with respect. Notice there, he says, if they were acting uncomely. Not to treat her as a little girl anymore, but to treat her with respect, and as well as not to put her in a position where she feels like she cannot find a spouse. It's kind of the whole idea of this passage is to allow the adult, unmarried daughter to still be able to go and find a spouse. Now, wisdom would dictate as well, and those of you who have been married might agree with me on this, that when your children, and grandchildren for some of you, or great-grandchildren, are wanting to get married, you would want to encourage them to seek godly counsel. To check with those who've made those mistakes so that they don't have to. I don't want to see a raise of hands, but this is kind of a rhetorical question. But I think there are many of us here, whether it's been us personally, or we know of family members or friends or loved ones who have all chosen foolishly in marriage. And they now regret it, and they're like, man, I wish I would have seen this coming. I wish I would have known. And then their friends say, well, yeah, we knew he was a total dirtbag. Right? We tried to tell you, but you just said, but we are so in love. So, my counsel to those, anyone who wants to get married, seek godly counsel. If you can get it from your parents or grandparents, seek it. If you can get it, from any person who can give you that good, wise counsel, that would be, it would be helpful. It's not a cure-all. It's not going to be, perfect. But sometimes when you're so caught up in that relationship, that old phrase, love is blind, comes in, and you don't notice your prospective spouse's faults and issues that they deal with. So continuing on, verse 37, Paul says, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So here it's still talking about that man, and he says there, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, his basically purposing in his mind, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed, or literally judged in his heart, that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So he says there, be wise, fathers. Be wise. And then verse 38, so then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well. But he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. This goes back to that statement that Paul had said, that it would be better if they could remain as Paul remains, single and without marriage. And so here Paul is writing and saying, listen, either way, it's going to be good. There's nothing unscriptural about it. Dad, you give your daughter away in marriage, it's a good thing. But if she does not want to be married, it's also a better thing, because she can then serve the Lord. Point number 3, verses 39 and 40, until death do us part. Verse 39, Paul there says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. So there Paul basically says, what should be the only thing that breaks up a marriage? Should be death. The only thing that ought to break our marriages is death. And those of us who are married, we need to show that to our young people. We need to make it that there is no escape plan. Now, I do know that there are circumstances and situations that a breakup of that marriage is probably for the best. Don't get me wrong. But biblically, Paul says, the marriage ought to be staying together. There's no escape plan. There should be never any talk of divorce. Should never even be a threat of it. It should never even be something you joke about. You don't ever want your spouse to think that that joke is true. That would only create problems and a skillet thrown at your head. I have not had a skillet thrown at my head. I don't know why I keep saying that.
You haven't even lived yet.
So I just realized, I'm saying that 3 times. Yeah. My wife is mortified because she's afraid that all of you guys are thinking that she's throwing skillets at me. But my guess is that the majority of you would be like, well, he probably deserved it. So don't worry. They wouldn't think of you ill, babe. It would just be me. Verse 40. Closing up, he says, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So Paul basically says, listen, if you choose not to get married after your spouse dies and you're able to remain single, God bless you. That would be great. But again, there's some of you who absolutely need to get married. But one of the things I do want to just point out here, especially in verse 39. Notice there that Paul makes it clear that marriage vows only last until death do us part. And that Paul also says for the widow or the widower that they are at liberty to be married to whom they will. Now, I know I might be stepping on some toes. But Paul there is saying that you as the surviving spouse, you have the choice to marry whomever you want. But notice, though, that Paul does give a little caveat there in verse 39. Only in the Lord. And that means a fellow believer. That when you get married, you can choose whoever you want. Now, I know, and this is where I'm stepping on toes, and I used to think this as well and preached it, that it used to be, especially when we were growing up in the church, it was God has that one person for you. And looking at this passage, I would have to say that that's not true. And before you get mad at me for saying that God doesn't have one person set aside for you, really look at this passage and show me scripturally where God has one person for you. I think really what it is by us living in the age of grace right now, that we legit just have our choice. That God wants us to marry a fellow believer. But he's not going to say, Geoff, you have to marry Nisha because that's the only person for you. Now, did I choose rightly? Of course I did. But God wants us to use wisdom and guidance to choose our spouse, whether it's for the first marriage or second marriage or whatever it might be. But to use that wisdom and the guidance and to know and understand. You have that freedom. You see, the breakdown on that whole aspect of God has chosen this one for you and all of that is, I don't know about you, and I'm naturally cynical. You get that imitation about a couple getting married, and they said, yeah, this is, God had chose this man to be my husband or this woman to be my wife, and then 2 years later they get divorced. And you say, well, did God choose for you guys to be divorced? What happened? And really what it comes down to, it, guys, I think, is the influence in the American church still from the founding pilgrims, if you will, their Calvinism. That was hugely influential in our nation, and especially in the Christian realm, where God chooses those whom he damns and chooses those whom he saves. And yeah, that's just simplifying what Calvinism teaches. But we have free grace. And we have grace to choose who we want to marry. And what a blessing that is. But Paul says, let it be in the Lord that you marry someone who's a fellow believer. So, with that being said, we finish 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father,